When I Was Eight, a story by Christy Jordan Fenton and Margaret Pokiak Fenton, illustrated by Gabrielle Grimard. When I Was Eight is an indigenous tale about a young girl named Olamo. That was the original name Margaret had before she was given the name Margaret. So, When I Was Eight was co-authored by, as I've already said, Christy Jordan Fenton and her mother-in-law, Margaret Pokiak Fenton. The two also wrote the acclaimed 2010 book Fatty Legs. They also wrote Not My Girl. Christy was born in rural Alberta. She eventually would leave for Ontario, but returned west to live right here in Fort St. John with her husband. Her children led to a revitalizing of her passion for Native issues, and she would go on to write stories with help from her mother-in-law, Margaret. Margaret was born June 7th, 1936, and was a Western Canadian Inuit. She was an author and residential school survivor. She was born in Vancouver, British Columbia, before her family would move to Banks Island in the Northwest Territories. When she was 8 years old, she attended the Immaculate Conception Residential School. She had a strong desire to learn how to read and begged to go to her father, even with the schools at that point harmful. Well, for most of its history, but even by that time it still had developed a harmful reputation. When she returned home, she could no longer speak with her mother, as her mother could not speak English, and Margaret had forgotten her native language. Margaret unfortunately passed away on April 21st, 2021. The story begins by explaining what Olemon knows at 8 years old. Olemon is the indigenous name Margaret had before she was given the name Margaret at the residential school. It mostly talked about the traditional skills of the Inuit, keeping sled dogs quiet, skills related to hunting. She didn't know how to read, however, and she also didn't learn from listening to her older sister Rosie and her books. Olemon would ask her father to go to the outsider's school, but he always refused. One day that changed, however, and he relented, and after traveling to trade, he left her at the school. A nun would cut her hair, replace her clothes, give her a new name, basically take away her culture and individuality, and the attempt, of course, to accomplish the main goal of residential schools, which was assimilation. She'd do chores every day, and the chores were meant to instill this sense of almost discipline or obedience to the ideals the school was trying to impress upon the indigenous peoples. She could not read, nor could she speak English. She was treated very harshly by the nuns. And because she couldn't speak English or read, she was punished by them, forced to sit in the corner with her nose in the corner, humiliated in front of the rest of the class. The nuns gave her more chores, more and more work. She didn't let that get to her, however. She studied each letter, learned new words, improved her reading comprehension. But even still, it wasn't good enough for the nuns, who'd still quarrel with her, and she'd eventually be sent to the basement. And even though it was dark, and even though it was almost alien in a way, it was like fearful. It was like she was alone. She overcame that fear and that darkness by clinging to her desire and her dream to learn how to read. She imagined the letters out loud, she imagined the words, she started spelling them, and she was strengthened by this newfound ability to read and to spell. I just kind of need to speed this up now because this is getting kind of long. So things were only going to get worse. The nuns gave everyone new stockings. They were gray and cozy. Oleman, however, was given red stockings. She thought they were kind of like a clown stockings. Eventually, she was assigned to work in the laundry, and there was a fire in the laundry which she'd burn her red stockings. The nuns couldn't find where she must have hidden it or where she lost them, and so they gave her New ones. Gray, just like the other girls had. The old nun now wanted to cut her down to size and forced her to read out of a more advanced green book for like the more older students. Even though she was nervous, she managed to sound out the words and slice through the paragraphs. The nun allowed her to return to her seat as there was nothing more she could do. Oleman had showed her that she had learned how to read even through all that adversity. She felt like Alice through the looking glass, whom she knew, like many things, because now she could read. The story is set in Oleman's village before she's dropped off at the residential school. As the story is based off Margaret's own personal experiences, the school she goes to is most likely the Immaculate Conception Residential School, ran from 1926 to 1959, and in close proximity to the community she grew up in, Banks Island. The school ran from 1926 to 1959. The story specifically takes place in the bunks, the classroom, the laundry, and the basement of the residential schools. For characters, the main character of the book is a girl named Oleman, character representing Margaret herself. She's a young girl, only 8 years old, who is forced to endure the residential school system. Other characters in the story include Oleman's father, who we aren't introduced to, the other children, who we don't interact with much, the nuns, whose only character traits are that they are very cruel to Oleman, and her older sister Rosie, who she seems to have the closest relationship to, though again we aren't given much interaction with her. The theme and messages. The theme of the book is determination and perseverance. The black-cloaked nun tries at every turn to shatter Margaret's spirit, attempting to break her individuality and assert her power over Margaret. Margaret doesn't let that happen, and even though the nuns make learning to read much harder than it has to be for her, it does not stop her. She doesn't give up. She gives every day her all. She shows courage and endures difficult situations, all as she gets closer to her goal. There are also messages that can be learned from the story, almost like an inspirational tale, a message that if she can learn to read through all that with just a bit of courage and determination, you can get through your problems if you try your best. That it's possible to do these things. Sort of inspirational in that kind of vein. The illustrations. The illustrations kind of remind me of a children's book. Like Little Red Riding Hood, with a cute art style, a children's focus. If it wasn't for the dark subject matter, then it would be a general children's novel. But, however, or it could be to relate to the audience that the horrors of the story are occurring to a child. Like we can see all these terrible things happening, but we can also see like these illustrations. This is an 8-year-old girl that these twisted things are happening to. They'd also display letters and words as she begins to improve her knowledge of English and reading. The illustrations show the nun towering over her. It allows us to conceptualize the characters and their surroundings, the dynamics of the story, the way the author intends us to, without having to describe them in much detail. Because again, it is a rather short book. And via those illustrations, it's kind of a show, don't tell. Language. One item I was unfamiliar with, and that I've decided to dedicate this entire section to, is an ulu knife. I did some research, and it's a knife primarily used by women for all sorts of things. It's kind of all-purpose. It's used not only by the Inuit, but groups in Alaska, like the Inupiat, the Yupik, the Aluits. It can be used for skinning, cleaning animals, cutting hair, cutting food, or even trimming blocks used to create igloos. It's primarily used by women, of course. All those sorts of things, and I'd never heard about it before, and so I thought it was interesting language to dive further into and to explore. And now we come up to the last part. My apologies for this being so long. It's somehow turned into quite the 10-minute video, but now we're on the recommendation. So I believe people should read this book, as not only does it offer a lens into history and the perspectives of Indigenous people in Canada, but offers a universal lesson in perseverance even under hardship. Even as this institution, like across the country, brought in by the government of Canada, is crushing down on her, Margaret still continues to try to learn to read. She suffers terrible emotional and physical, psychological abuse. She doesn't have anyone there to support her apart from herself, and but she refuses to let it get to her, and completes her goal of learning to read, which isn't easy, and is certainly less easy when she's trying to do that at a residential school. It's a story that I believe offers a positive lesson, not just to those in Canada, and not just to those Indigenous or who had a sort of connection to the residential schools, but all Canadians and even people abroad. It encapsulates an important human quality in the form of continuing on and not giving up, almost like getting up when you fall down. Perseverance is one of the most important skills a person can learn. Some people go their whole lives without learning it, so I definitely recommend reading this book. It was a good lesson for me as well. I finished it, and it left me wondering, which is what any good book should. And that is the end. Sorry for making you sit through 10 minutes of this, but I enjoyed the project, and have a good day. Thank you.